Welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, working with the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Sandrine Dixson-Decleve, co-president of the Club of Rome, which is a group of 100 scientists, economists, business leaders and former politicians who seek to define comprehensive solutions to the complex, interconnected challenges of our world. Sandrine Dixson-Decleve also holds several advisory positions for the European Commission, sits on the boards of numerous companies and institutes, and has been recognized by GreenBiz as one of the 30 most influential women across the globe, driving change in the low-carbon economy and promoting green business, amongst many other accomplishments. Sandrine Dixson-Decleve, welcome to C2G Talk.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, let's dive into it. In August last year, the Club of Rome launched its Planetary Emergency Plan 2.0, making the case that we're living beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. We're putting human systems on a collision course with natural systems of which we're a part. Could you just help us understand a little bit about the core ideas behind this concept, and then maybe how they relate to the various ways in which the world is approaching its many interconnected crises?
Absolutely. So as you may or may not know, the Club of Rome was started by Aurelio Peccei already more than 50 years ago in 1968. And in 1972, with the publication of The Limits to Growth, Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows and the other distinguished scientists that worked on the modeling of actually where population growth would continue to put stress on the planetary boundaries, indicated that we would have continuous crises. And for the last 50 years, the Club of Rome has been discussing this, has been speaking about it, publishing, engaging with policymakers to ensure that we take into consideration the fact that we actually are, as human beings, really putting a stress on these planetary boundaries. And 3 years ago, with the climate crisis and actually what we were claiming to be a climate emergency, we felt that it was important to bring out our climate emergency plan with Potsdam Institute. And I know that you've also interviewed Johan Rockström recently, and he and I felt that it was necessary once again to speak about the fact that we are in an emergency. Because actually, Mark, interestingly enough, no one was using the emergency language.
Really?
We came out in August, and then in September, Greta Thunberg actually hit the streets. And I think the voice of the youth was absolutely fundamental in starting to open our eyes once again to the fact that we truly are in an emergency. So what has happened over the last 3 years? Well, the climate emergency plan has turned into a planetary emergency plan because we've been hit not only with the climate crisis, all those crises that we were told were going to hit us by Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows already 50 years ago. We're now confronted with the biodiversity crisis and the fact that we are losing the extinction of species every single day, as well as now the health crisis. And if you take those tipping points together, and if you look also at the human dimension, we felt that it was absolutely essential that we start to talk about this existential crisis, and that we clearly state that we are now in a planetary emergency, that it's no longer just a climate emergency, and that these tipping points together are now creating the greatest existential risk. So how do we then move forward? Well, the first was claiming that we're in an emergency. And we have now a series of jurisdictions across the globe who have claimed more than 1,900 different cities and nations, 23 nations that have declared an emergency. So for us, actually, the case within the planetary emergency plan was to first declare. But then the second was to ensure that actually we bring in key actions, that we activate the different necessary local authorities, national authorities, different agencies around this emergency and around 10 core actions and commitments for the global commons, because we know we are fully dependent on our forests, on our oceans, on our rivers, on our cryosphere, the Arctic, etc. But also that we have 10 key new calls to action for transformational change, which span the need to shift out of fossil energy and to ensure that we also move into a circular and regenerative economy. And then thirdly, and importantly, that we look at that human dimension, that we bring in clear, just transition plans, that we work more with Indigenous peoples who are actually the keepers of our land, smallholders, small farmers, and that we take into consideration that this is a journey that has to be communicated to people and give them the possibility to emerge from the emergency. One of the key messages that we also have in this climate emergency plan is, once we declare an emergency, let's be clear that we can actually emerge if we do it now, because we don't have enough time. So that is a little bit the genesis of where we come from and why we feel that it's so important to start to work with nation states, but also local authorities and citizens to understand what the emergency means in practice and translate that into key actions.
You know, this rarely happens, but just now that you said, linked the word emergency and emerge, I realized I had never linked those two ideas before. I mean, obviously it's an emergence of some sort. So yeah, I'd love to, at the same time, you know, I've been in various events where people are talking about emerging. Tell me a little bit more about how you link the concept of emergency and emergence or emerging. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that before diving into.
Well, for the Club of Rome and also the work that I do in advising different corporate organizations as well as NGOs and also governments, I think it's really important that when we talk about emergence, it's almost like a renaissance. It's a positive connotation of the emergency, but you can't have one without the next. So unfortunately, humanity often has to have its back against the wall before it starts to act. That's why we still need to ensure that we anchor emergency plans. But then the beauty of emergence is to say that we as humanity, if we do use our collective wisdom, if we do understand the benefits of technology for people, planet, and prosperity, not just for profit, if we start to shift into a new type of civilization. So this goes beyond just the technocratic understanding of the emergency and just putting in place actually technological actions. This is about systems change. This is about understanding that actually we are at a time where not only we've gone beyond our planetary boundaries, but where our economic system does not service people, planet, and prosperity, where we have not taken into consideration the true value systems that we need, actually tapping into the subconsciousness that's coming out of COVID, by the way, and understanding what truly is essential. So I think that there's a beauty in emergence, which demonstrates that, okay, there's a level of despair in emergency, but if we can come together and look at a new civilization, a new society, one where we don't have to just think about gloom and doom, then we can bring some level of light and creativity and co-creation and the beauty of building a better future, bouncing forward rather than just building back better. I think that actually is the excitement of the emergence. And to do that, actually, let me just add maybe one last point.
Sure.
Within the Club of Rome, we've set up 5 key, what we call action hubs. These impact hubs are looking at not only financing change, but changing the finance system, rethinking the finance system, transformational economics, for example, the 21st century, looking at new indicators for well-being, new indicators to economic development, which we're working on with the Potsdam Institute, by the way, and the Norwegian Business School, and coming up with a brand new model, which we're calling the Earth for All model and project, which is building in turnaround pathways. Again, an excitement behind the emergence, and then working with youth through our youth hub, and then understanding how all of that comes together.
You mentioned the limits to growth earlier on, obviously one of the foundational documents. And back then, of course, there was a warning that, you know, humanity's behavior would lead to a convergence of crises. Convergence, emergence, I don't know. Anyway, we didn't act accordingly. And what have we learned since then? I mean, part of it will be the context has shifted and some of these things have become, you know, emerged as predicted. But what have we learned since then about how to communicate about this and how to translate this understanding into actual action by governments? Are there some key points along the road where the Club of Rome took some lessons and is applying that now?
Yeah, I think what we've really learned is that science-based decision making, for example, is fundamental. And if you look at the new IPCC report that's come out, we talk about net zero for 2050. Now we're going to have to think about net zero for 2030. If there's a willingness and not short-term decision making, which unfortunately is also part of the learnings, that with the current political system as we have it and the short-term decision making, we therefore again are caught in a system that doesn't put in place the real system shifts that we need to deal with this emergency that we have before us. So one of the key learnings there is ensuring that we actually get the political will to translate the science into policy. And that's really fundamental. I think the other key learning is that you have to bring on board international, national, and local leaders. We can see it from the Paris Agreement and also the work that we did through Paris. The local authorities have been phenomenal in working with their communities. And in fact, they've been the first, even in the United States, when we had President Trump in power and when he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. What kept on going in terms of decarbonization in the US economy was the cities. It was the states. It was their decision. So I think the big learning there is that, the big kind of only international sphere of decision making or national sphere is not going to work. The whole bottom-up movement, the citizens movement, the voice of the youth, the way in which we can optimize and bring different stakeholders and have radical partnerships. I think those are also the key learnings. So we do have a lot of possibilities within our toolbox. We've got the technology. We know that we've got the capital and the financial possibility to shift. And we know that we actually now, through many surveys, people are saying we want change, both coming out of COVID, but also prior to COVID. And many of them are realizing that this is the first generation that's going to make less than their parents, that we have the highest level, in particular in the West, of suicide rates, and the highest level of mental illness and disenfranchisement. So there is a malaise. And I think that all of this together demonstrates that there is a growing part of society that's calling for a change.
So some of what you were talking about there is very much in line with what C2G, Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, considers to be governance. It's not just governments, it's a much broader concept, bringing in decision makers and discussions and learning across all of society at different levels. But does putting this within a frame of emergency, does that affect the way decisions are made, how risk is calculated? Does it potentially even imply, as in the case of some concepts of emergency, suspending governance norms and rushing to, for example, in COVID, we saw a change of the speed at which vaccines could be. So in a broader level, do we see a shift in the way we actually go about governance under an emergency framing?
Absolutely. And of course, the call for better governance and more targeted governance cannot be superseded by governance for the few and not having a continued public discourse or democratic system. So I think governance is absolutely fundamental, coming from the principle that we need to ensure that the decision making is made for the people and for citizens, and also trying to enhance, obviously, again, the livelihoods of these citizens. So it should, if we think about the emergency plan, an emergency plan should influence decision-making and action taking when a nation declares an emergency. In the same way that a business declares an emergency, you put in place the right actions, you put in place the right agencies, you put in place the right people to act and policies to shift. So you have to design the plans and you have to break down the silos. And you have to ensure that when you do that, you continue to communicate. Those are the opportunities. It actually is a better form of governance, in my view, because it's a governance for people, planet, and prosperity, working together to ensure that we make this work. And let me say that in that sense, the well-being governments of New Zealand, of Iceland, of Scotland, of Wales and Finland, who have had well-being indicators in place before COVID, and also a way of communicating, which was totally different, which was much more around ensuring that people understood why we might have to put certain policies in place, but not using them to strong arm and curtail freedom, which I think is very important. So these are the benefits, but let me get you into the risks, because there are some risks, clearly. And I think that the key risk is the misuse of power and autocratic decision-making. The fact that actually we are not taking this new governance model in an emergency realm as a way to ensure that we protect people, but instead this is all about power, and power of the leader or of an individual. The also immediacy of needing certain solutions, and that means starting to pick certain winners. And this is where geoengineering could become an issue, right? The fact that we're going to race as fast as possible to what we think could be the most effective and fastest solution. Or some would even claim, let's get off the planet and go to Mars. I would say our mission is not to get to Mars or the moon. Our mission is to save the planet. We're not just going to evacuate. So this in itself could be a real risk. And if we don't, in particular, put in place the right governance and rules to ensure that we don't get into that risk area and that we manage our risk properly, then I think we have a proper plan in place. But those are definitely potential risks. And then public panic, you know, that we enhance the panicking of people, the despair, that we don't explain properly, again, that this could be an emergence or a renaissance.
So we'll get into a couple of more specific details about geoengineering as you raise it in a second. I just wanted to dig a little more into one aspect, well, is managing risk and involving publics in that. Risk is notoriously difficult to communicate about. And it's just complicated, especially when you're trying to assess the risk of doing something against the risk of not doing something. And then, of course, risks are different for different people, and people have different frameworks via which they'll decide how to assess risk. What are you learning about how you get a broader conversation with publics in some sort of kind of broader governance system about risk, helping people to understand risk in a way that doesn't make everyone's eyes glaze over and using all sorts of complicated, you know, mathematical formulae and so on? How do you get people onto the same kind of understanding of what would be considered a good result and a bad result? And what are you learning about that?
You know, I think that beyond, obviously, the evidence and the case studies and the science, we need to get better at telling stories. We need to get better at bringing examples to people that they will understand. The risk to an Indian woman or a German man is totally different. And even within either Germany or India, the risks are completely different depending on where you sit in society and where you are. I always find it quite amazing that if you say to someone, for example, climbing onto this plane, the pilot is claiming that it's going to crash, or actually it has a 90% possibility of crashing. Would you, even if it was 2%, climb onto that plane and still allow the pilot to fly you? I think if we explain that in the same way about the planet and say the direction that we're taking right now is basically going to make us all crash. We will no longer have homes. We will no longer have livelihoods. We will continue to have more pandemics. But don't just explain that in a vacuum. Give them a very specific case that they might understand, or going into a boat that's going to sink. I think that is a way where people will start to think, hold on, there is a risk here. Now, translating that risk into action, we know that it's very difficult, and individual people and citizens, some will go ahead and shift their lifestyles and are ready to do so. Many, however, will be waiting for the political will, for the levers to come actually from politicians and business leaders. And this is where I believe that we need to strong arm a bit more our political leaders and our business leaders and indicate that they have to be part of this emergence, that we cannot do it without them. It's not just about citizen will. It will be about putting in place the right governance and the right rules that are comparable to the risk at hand.
Speaking of strong arming, I think you sent a message, wasn't it, to the recent G7 with a bit of critique there. I think let's jump into climate, especially as we're heading towards, well, we're hearing a lot about IPCC reporting the news recently, because of quite alarming things, but also just a general sense from a growing number of very reputable bodies that 1.5 is looking like a very difficult, if not close to impossible task at the moment. WMO, I think, suggested the chance of breaching at least temporarily 1.5 over the next 5 years is 4%. We're seeing a lot of these kind of warnings. So now, obviously, to achieve net zero emissions and limit global warming to 1.5, we're going to have to see transformational emission reduction and large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Are you seeing the planetary emergency framing helping leaders to actually move beyond rhetoric and actually start taking the decisions that need to be made? We feel a lot in the air of commitments, but are things actually really beginning to happen at the pace and speed in the limited time that is left to, if there is any, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees? And how is the emergency framing sort of playing into that right now?
So I think if you look at the Secretary General that is already using the emergency framework of the UN, it's pretty clear that the emergency framing has now basically come into the discourse. The key problem we have now is that before we thought that the emergency was not here right now. We were still able to say, okay, yes, we're moving into an emergency, but we have until 2050. And then we can actually hit net zero in 2050. But now we're hearing from the IPCC in recent scientific reports that no, we don't have until 2050. And many of us have been saying this for quite some time. But the clarity of the message will be coming out in August in the final report. So what do you actually do then? And I think that, yes, the emergency framing is now part of the discourse, but it's translating that discourse into the action. We're seeing a series of different types of initiatives that are moving forward, that are getting us into this real transformational thinking. We've got the Race to Zero, which is being led by the champions for the UN COP26. We've got the Race to Resilience, which is bringing all these different business leaders and local leaders together, where they're really starting to commit to a shift. We also have clearly our own emergency plan, and we're starting to see that our calls for at least 50% reductions each decade is now being taken into consideration with the 2030 calls. But again, we have to rethink, because things are changing so fast that that's not even enough. And we're going to have to go even further. And then I think that the third key area where, and in fact, 3 and 4. So the third key area is the fact that we have more and more reports indicating that the technology is here, whether it's parity of pricing with regard to renewables. We look at the IEA report recently that is saying also that we need to move faster, and we can do it with the technology that we have and new innovations. I'm ambassador of the Energy Transition Commission that has come out with a series of reports on electrification, power, and green hydrogen. So we know we've got the technology. We have more and more of our finance leaders, whether it's Mark Carney, who was previously at the at the central bank, but also others who are saying that we can do this. I think the key now is the speed. And the fact that we have to, and this comes back to the previous point, get better at describing what the future looks like. If we don't do that, actually, I am worried, Mark, that we will not get people on the journey, that they will protest in the streets. We already have social unrest. We already had the Gilets jaunes just because we actually increased the diesel tax in France. We will have more people protesting if we cannot show them what the future looks like, that it's not just about sacrifice, that actually it is creating a more balanced, economy that fosters well-being. And I think that is fundamental.
I wonder if I could just ask your thoughts on carbon dioxide removal part of the equation. Is that something that you're considering? It's becoming a lot of interest in it right now. Is it possible for society, and especially to tackle some of the, hardest to abate emissions? Do you think there's a way in which society can produce some of those options, both nature-based and technology-based, without undermining emission cuts? And how much is that part of your thinking now?
I think we need all tools in the toolbox right now. Absolutely, we need to think about carbon removal, and we do need to bring it into a perspective that isn't just about offsetting, that it doesn't just become an easy way out. The biggest problem with humanity is that it's complacent, right? And complacency is truly what's killing us. That's also, by the way, I think the beauty of the message of emergence. Let's really get down and demonstrate against all odds that actually we are truly wise. As Jane Goodall says, we are the most intelligent species, but we're not necessarily the wisest. So can we prove Jane wrong? Can we actually prove everyone wrong and say, yes, collectively we can come together, use these different tools in the toolbox, work together to enhance that? But my only caveat to that is we have to stop thinking that technology is going to save the day. If we don't shift our consumption, if we don't shift our ways of living and actually look at a new type of economy, finance system that underpins this shift, then we won't get there.
I definitely want to pick up this concept of technology saving the day in a minute, but actually I just wanted to touch on one of the issues that C2G is very focused on, which is the governance of a new potential set of approaches that people are talking about, which I don't think anyone yet is saying saving the day. It just might be another way to reduce risk. So go those arguing in favor of this research called solar radiation modification. These are the idea that you might reflect some sunlight to lower temperatures, potentially to give yourself a bit more time, although some people have rejected that concept of buying time, but at least reduce the risk of overshooting temperature goals. And this may come to a head, I guess, as we also hit some potential tipping points. Ideas to brighten marine clouds, increase ground reflectivity, spray even, this is the controversial one, reflective aerosols into the stratosphere. And I think the IPCC is going to be taking a good look at this in its assessment report as well. Do you, at the same time, clearly there's a lot of uncertainty and concern about these ideas and their governance and what effect even their consideration might have on other action. How might the planetary emergency approach help us think about governing the consideration of the research of, even at one stage, potentially the deployment of some of these ideas? How can it help people think about the risks of doing something against the risks of not doing it? Can the emergency framing guide people in the governance of these approaches?
So my background, in fact, I started by putting environmental management systems in nuclear facilities. So let me take the nuclear risk, right? And the emergency risk. So in a nuclear facility, there are clear protocols of what to do and what not to do. So my message on this particular point, and has been from the beginning in terms of an emergency plan, is we have to put in those protocols of what we should be doing and what we cannot do. The protocols are not just about the technology. The protocols are because they understand that people will take risks and that people are a risk, no matter how they handle certain emergency situations. So they may cause an emergency and they may not handle an emergency properly. So I think it's very important when we look at the way in which we've proposed our emergency plans to also take into consideration that if you work in an area where there have been emergencies in the past, you learn from that. You put in place the right protocols, the right governance rules in order to ensure that actually you get out of the emergency, and then you truly protect people, prepare for the next emergency, and then transform if you need to transform. And that is also part of the messaging that we're coming out with a group of experts actually in the European Commission on research and innovation, because we're saying we have to think about the protect, prepare, and transform elements of the way in which we deal with emergency planning.
So how does one find those protocols when sometimes the discussion may not allow essentially guardrails, but actually people who have a fundamental ideological position towards one side or another, that we should not do this, or we should be exploring this? How do you find, where do you go about helping society to take decisions when, especially let's say something like stratospheric aerosol injection, which can touch on our entire understanding of who we are, how we relate to the cosmos, how religious points of view and what humanity should or should not be doing. How can you sort of translate some of those big questions into what might sound like a more technocratic process of going about designing rules and regulations and guidelines and safeguards? How do you square those sort of different aspects of taking decisions about this?
Well, I mean, clearly it's going to happen at the international level as well as at the national level. As we have nuclear protocol treaties or other treaties, we will have to think about a treaty in terms of governance, because it could truly either get into the wrong hands or also truly have an impact. I mean, it is very difficult to know right now what this technology could do if it was applied in many countries across many atmospheric territorial areas as possible. So I do worry about that. I think that is why we would need to look at the international level in terms of what type of governance rules we would need to put in place. But I also think the key issue that we have is we still have this siloed thinking and this siloed approach to policy. If truly geoengineering or any other aspect of geoengineering or carbon removal, or as you indicate, solar radiation modification, if any of this is truly going to come into being, it has to be looked at in a broader package of what the other tools in the toolbox are, so that we can decide again together what makes the most sense. Because yes, we may have to immediately agree as soon as possible, in particular with the IPCC report that's coming out, that we're going to have to go even faster. So what does going even faster mean? And then evaluate that and then optimize by decreasing the silos in these different approaches and ensuring that we really bring in all of the different possible mechanisms to enable us to get to decarbonization faster. So that would be my first point. I think that the other key point would be that any type of emergency framing at the governance level, which would enable some of these technologies to come to fruition, would really need to be very clear in terms of the decision-making process. Who actually has the ultimate say? I'm coming from my nuclear hat here. It's very clear in the protocol who has the ultimate say in terms of either a nuclear accident or the way in which you're actually managing a nuclear site. And I think all of that needs to be very clearly outlined in whatever protocol or treaty that we put forward.
I wanted to touch just briefly, or up to you actually, it could be not briefly, but you mentioned the technology won't get us out of this kind of framing, and or we can't rely on technology to save us, I think was the framing that you used. Saving, I'm not sure what, yeah, it's an interesting one. It has all sorts of connotations, the concept saving. Yeah. But what I have learned, as I've been exploring some of these issues, is the degree to which you often find that you think you're having a conversation about one thing, but actually you're often having a conversation about a fundamental attitude towards technology or nature. And sometimes you see these two in opposition. I think even there's a good book written about this called The Wizard and the Prophet, of the history of the environmental movement, having these sort of back to nature, Mother Earth, against some, we can tech our way to, and we've almost got this duality where you've got to pick sides sometimes, and you hear this in the discourse. Nature is good, technology is bad. You say, no, we'll only get it with technology. Are these two, is nature and technology in opposition, or are there ways of finding a way to bring this together to somehow overcome the difficulties and the misunderstandings and sometimes the fundamental kind of moral disagreements that people have when we're having these difficult discussions about geoengineering or any other difficult technologies? How do we reconcile nature and technology moving forwards?
So I think that's a very good question. And I'd like to maybe take a step back in terms of what I think is the ultimate hampering of humanity in making the right decisions. And that is the human being, him or herself. I think that the biggest issue is that we have this disjointed approach to the way in which we deal with technology and nature. And we have a disjointed approach in terms of the way in which we actually look at the world around us, rather than realizing, as my co-president at the Club of Rome would say, that we are part of nature and nature is part of us. And we produce technology. Technology is not produced in a vacuum. Let's pretend that technology is not actually being invented by human beings. So it's too easy to blame technology and say that technology does not have a role. But then we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of technology? What is the purpose not only of technology, but our economic system? What is the purpose of a financial system? And if we then go back and ask that question, that's when we start to unlock the real issues and the challenges. Because the purpose of technology, and I grew up in Silicon Valley, just outside of San Francisco and Palo Alto, the heart of the dot-com boom and the IT boom. And the fact is that we now have the highest percentage of heroin users in San Francisco. We have the highest percent of homelessness just around San Francisco. You cannot tell me that this dot-com boom, IT boom was technology for the people. People are becoming homeless because they can't afford to live in these areas. So we have totally forgotten actually what technology is for. We have forgotten what the market is for. I sit on the UN Food Systems Summit and we talk about resilience in food systems and we talk about access to nutritious food. Well, what about access to food full stop? What about access to water? Technology can enable us in some ways through smart technology, but just putting in place the right rules and the right ways in which we can enhance access to food, the right distribution systems, etc., will also enable us, as will ensuring that the soil that grows, that we don't deforest as we actually trade in certain commodities, etc. So what I'm trying to say, Mark, is that I often find that we always ask the simple questions, but we don't dig deeper into the real causes of why we got to where we are, which is the greatest existential risk to humanity. And we are our largest culprit. We're the ones that are making that the greatest risk. So it is now the time to admit that nature, technology, and the human spirit together could actually potentially get us out of this mess if we act fast enough.
Well, we're the ones, but of course, some of us more than others, I guess, their responsibility.
Absolutely.
If I could just finish on one, just a slightly personal note. When anybody spends too much time in the climate and reading all these documents, especially in Emergency, and realizing the scale and complexity, it could become very difficult to deal with emotionally. It can lead to despondency and grief and even some forms of trauma. How do you maintain your enthusiasm, a sense of optimism, whilst also not downplaying the gravity of the crisis and accepting it in all its deep, complex difficulty? How do you manage that personally?
Well, it's not always easy. And I must say that when I joined the Club of Rome, I really started to read all the publications and thought to myself, my God, we've been talking about this now for the last 50 years. I had already started 30 years ago my career in this area, and I'm still actively involved. I think that, part of the problem is that we don't understand history and we don't bring history and our learnings to bear. And that is something that excites me. that we can learn from the past, that we can also learn from the incredible heroes and heroines that we've had in the past and in the present as ways to really get us out of this mess, working together in some incredible situations, conflict zones, fragile zones, and in urban zones, rural zones, etc. People who are really constantly positive and trying to create a better life, not only for themselves and their families, but for others. I'm also a mother. And as a mother, I have no choice. I brought 2 children into this world, and there is no way that I'm going to give up until my last breath, trying to make sure that their lives are as good as mine was. That's my fundamental goal in life, is to ensure and secure the well-being of my children and future generations. And then I guess the last point is, I really believe that we can get through this. I like the idea of innovation. I like the idea of coming forward with new ideas and working together collectively to really get through the hardship. I'm not frightened by hardship. And I think that is a problem, as most people are. But we have to understand that if we're going to see the light, sometimes we're going to have some gray. And it's that gray that will start to enable us to get towards the light. So for me, it's important to continue to wake up in the morning and to believe that we truly can do this, even if it is daunting, even if most of the studies that are coming out today are demonstrating that it's going to be an incredible challenge. But I don't see any way out, and here I am continuing to pound the desk and talk to you about the key challenges that we have before us and the possible opportunities.
Well, Sandrine Dixson-Decleve, thank you so much for pounding the desk with us at C2G Talk, and really appreciated your time. It was a great chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure.